is in autism and adult women and teenage girls, and the reason is because it's something that is becoming more and more realized and like looked into in the community because of the kind of lack of attention and the differences it has between male and females. Yeah. So some of the most common symptoms in specifically females, they do happen in males as well, but more commonly in what you could call like high functioning adults or whatever the term, whatever not word, whatever they are diagnosed as. One of the big ones is not having good eye contact, especially during conversation. And then another one is misinterpreting things like body language, communication, social cues. And some of that has to do with like scripting their conversations. A lot of women who do have, or who are on the spectrum happen to have almost a script that they go off of in a conversation, and that's repeated, so you may not even have any idea that this person could be on the spectrum because they've like kind of prepared how they speak so fluently. Another one is just sensitivity to senses such as sounds and brightness. A big one is a loud sound coming out of nowhere that can cause a big kind of meltdown or maybe some kind of emotional response. Another one is unstable friendships that usually comes in during later in life, middle school, high school. Sometimes it's easier for them to form friendships rather than keep them because of this kind of scripted dialogue is another big reason because of that. Because it's something that is practiced and it's like, okay, I know how to talk to people, but being able to form a deep relationship is a little bit more difficult. Having a hard time with change and with moving on and changing, especially just from tasks, let alone big changes in life such as moving across the state or something like that. And the last one is just a very constant irritability, very hot-headed, almost in a way. It's very emotional responses to things that you wouldn't expect something to have an emotional response to. And then some other things that these are actually misdiagnosed as because autism was not as researched in women as it was in men back in the day when that was such a big, when it was becoming more popular. A lot of women are misdiagnosed with things like anxiety and depression, ADHD and ADD, as well as eating disorders. A lot of women do develop anorexia, and a lot of that does stem from some kind of correlation to the spectrum. And another one is ODD, which is having to do with not being able to handle authority well and handle commands and kind of being able to be told what to do very well.
Yeah, so as we kind of touched on this about like masking in younger girls and how she was diagnosed at a much later age than her younger brother. So the main reason why girls are misdiagnosed with autism is that they are misdiagnosed. So with the masking effect, what happens is that at a young age, they kind of imitate their social interactions. So they kind of pick up these social cues from interacting with some people. But as they kind of age, so as they become adolescent girls, it's harder to keep up their social relationships, as Daisy said. So with these social relationships and kind of struggling, this kind of leads them to developing anxiety and also depression at an adolescent age. And from the research article, or from the article I researched, it said that around 34 to 36% girls are much more likely to have depression and anxiety just because they are masking their symptoms. And also, an example that we saw was that there was a 2005 study in Stanford, and it showed that there was brain differences were found between boys and girls. But girls had a much greater matter, so gray area in regions where they were responsible for motor systems. So this is repetitive behavior like flopping. So that's why we can't really necessarily have the same diagnosis of autism for girls and also for young boys. So this is also another quote that Dr. Susan Epstein said. So it says, they might not understand what's going on, but they'll try to just go along and imitate what they see. So blending sort of masking comes in, and they may get away with it till 3rd or 5th grade, but once they enter junior high school, and junior high and high school definitely shows a problem. So this is where kind of their anxiety comes in, and also like Daisy said, it's much more harder to develop develop and keep social relationships at this age.
Okay, and then we're just gonna continue talking about diagnosed men versus women, but in 1995, there was an 8-to-1 sex ratio, so for every 8 men diagnosed, there was 1 woman diagnosed, but now it's 3-to-1, so obviously, like, there's much more of like a better detection of autism in women than men, and it probably will only improve. And as we've been saying, girls have less repetitive behavior and have like more socially acceptable interests. So we've talked a lot about in class how people with autism focus on certain interests. So women would tend to focus on something that's more socially acceptable rather than men, and so they get away with a lot more. And also girls in the age range of 17 to 37 months have more motor skill deficits, but less communication skill deficits, so they're still able to like mimic and do everything that Kendra was saying, but when it comes to motor skills, they have much more difficulty. And they just like use imitating as a coping strategy, even when social skills don't come naturally, because they just watch other people's behavior and can match that behavior. But then we see that in the future it becomes more of an issue. And they also are less likely to be diagnosed with autism as intelligence increases, because they're able to hold on to these coping strategies for much longer and able to blend in more despite having autism.
I just want to continue off what Amy said. And in healthcare, men are seen as kind of the standard, and women suffer because of this. They kind of just assume that female bodies function the same way. I thought interesting examples, like even for heart attacks, like doctors will research and like study heart attacks differently in men versus women. And also, women have higher expectations to understand social etiquette, and therefore they face much more consequences if they kind of like don't follow that standard. And depression and mood disorders are diagnosed at a higher rate in females. This may contribute to why so many autistic women are diagnosed with depression, but not with autism. But it's also interesting that oftentimes like women are diagnosed at a much like later age than men are.
And then the last thing, just want to mention something for discussion or just to think about. And so something like that is, considering something like this is very prevalent, it's not hard to take the belief that this isn't uncommon when it comes to other things like other diagnoses, other prescriptions, other kind of situations. So like for example, I know that like a lot of birth control hasn't been tested on women above like my weight and above. Like if you're like above 200 pounds, like your like birth control doesn't work on you most of the time if you don't have the right one, because it just wasn't tested on that. And that's something that like I think is something that it's in the same realm that like it was never tested on, so it's hard to pinpoint what do you do from there besides trying to identify what the certain symptoms are. So yeah.
Wonderful.
Any questions?
Any questions?